Hey guys, tonight we begin with the daily life of ancient Carthage, a city so wealthy, so powerful, and so relentlessly demanding of its inhabitants that simply existing inside it was already a full-time occupation. Then we spend time with Dido, the woman who founded the whole thing, whose story is either a myth or a tragedy or both, depending on how much you trust your sources. After that, you become a Carthaginian merchant sailor, which sounds glamorous, right up until the moment you realise what the sea actually cost you. And finally, we take a look at what Carthage was really doing with its gods, because the official version involves a great deal of piety and public devotion, and the unofficial version involves things that historians are still arguing about in very heated academic language. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is. I always like seeing where in the world people are watching from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up to noise, which is appropriate because Carthage does not do silence. The city begins before you do, and it does not wait for you to feel ready. Somewhere below the window of your narrow upper floor room, the harbour district is already operating at a volume that suggests it has been awake for hours, and would like you to understand that you are once again running behind. Your room is small, not charmingly compact, not efficiently designed. Small in the way that means you have already knocked something over by the time you reach the door. The walls are close enough that you can feel the heat of the building on both sides simultaneously, which would be useful in winter if Carthage had a meaningful winter, and is deeply counterproductive in every other season. Your sleeping mat was never quite right. You suspected this last night, and you can confirm it now, in the specific way that your lower back is registering its formal objection to the previous several hours. You stand. That part goes fine. You make your way to the narrow window and you look out, and for a moment before the noise and the smell and the heat fully register, you get to see what all of this was actually built for. The harbour. Even at this early hour, even before you have eaten or fully woken up, it is impressive. The circular military harbour sits at the centre, like something engineered by people who thought very seriously about what a harbour should do, and then built exactly that. Its inner island contained the Admiral's house and the facilities for the fleet, with 160 covered ship sheds arranged around it, in a configuration that was functional, and also, from certain angles, genuinely remarkable to look at. The commercial harbour stretches beyond it, busy with vessels arriving and departing with a kind of organised purpose that seems almost theatrical from above. The water catches the light in the way water does when someone has chosen a location very carefully, and Carthage was always a city of very careful choices. Then the wind shifts slightly, and the smell arrives, and you remember that beautiful harbours in ancient cities are also places where fish are processed, animals are transported, bilges are emptied, and several thousand people conduct their daily lives in close proximity without much in the way of plumbing. You step back from the window. The view was lovely. You will treasure the memory. Breakfast is a negotiation with what is available. In Carthage, what is available depends on your status, your neighbourhood, your connection to trade, and how early you managed to get yourself to the right part of the market before the better things were gone. For you this morning it is bread, which has been made from emmer wheat and is not soft olive oil for dipping, which is genuinely good and which you appreciate more than you expected to, and a handful of dried figs that have reached the point in their existence where they are technically still figs but are clearly in the process of becoming something else. There is also a small cup of something that might be wine diluted with a great deal of water, or water that has been in the presence of wine at some point in its recent history and absorbed certain qualities. It is warm. It is not helpful in the way you need help this morning. You eat quickly because the streets will only get worse as the day progresses, and because there is nothing about this meal that encourages lingering. Carthage is not a city that lets you move through it casually. It was built on a peninsula jutting into the Gulf of Tunis, and the geography shaped everything. The higher ground, the Bursa Hill at the centre, was where the oldest and most important structures lived. Temples, administrative buildings, the imposing presence of official Carthage looking down on everyone else. Below and around it, the city spread in dense residential neighbourhoods, narrow lanes, multi-storey houses pressed together in the way that happens when valuable land meets a lot of people who need to live on it. Ancient sources describe buildings of 6 stories in the residential quarters, which sounds optimistic until you consider the commercial pressure on space in any major port city and the particular ingenuity that pressure tends to produce. You step out into your street and immediately understand why Carthaginians developed a particular kind of purposeful stride. There is simply no room to wander. The lane is wide enough for two people to pass if both of them are cooperative about it, and cooperation is not the default setting of a busy commercial street in an ancient Mediterranean port city. Someone behind you is already walking faster than you. Someone in front of you has stopped for a reason that is not immediately apparent. A donkey loaded with amphorae is attempting to navigate a corner in a way that is not going well for the corner. You assess the donkey's situation. You decide to wait. This turns out to be the correct decision, if by correct you mean that the donkey eventually resolves the situation without anyone being injured, which takes longer than it should. The smell of the city in the morning is its own kind of geography. Fish sauce, which Carthage produced in enormous quantities, and which was both commercially valuable and unambiguous in its presence, an assertive smell that occupies a space in the air and refuses to share it. Smoke from bakeries and cooking fires, rising in thin columns from the ground floors of buildings where merchants have been at work since before the light was full. The warm animal smell of livestock being moved toward the market. The sharp mineral edge of dyes from the textile workshops. Carthage was famous for its purple cloth, the kind of purple extracted from murex shells through a process that required enormous quantities of shellfish and produced an extraordinary colour and a smell that has been described by ancient writers in terms that were not complimentary. You're getting a suggestion of that smell now, from somewhere upwind, and it is achieving things that a smell should not be able to achieve at this distance. It is the smell of wealth, if wealth smelled like something you would not voluntarily stand next to. You have learned to consider it a smell of prosperity, which helps. You move toward the market because almost everyone in Carthage moves toward the market at this hour. The commercial life of the city was its central fact. Carthage was not, at its core, a military civilization, or a religious one or an agricultural one, though it was all of those things to some degree. It was, fundamentally, a trading civilization. Its power came from controlling sea routes, establishing colonies along the North African coast and beyond, and doing business with a range of partners and competitors in ways that range from mutually beneficial to aggressively monopolistic depending on the situation. When you understand that, you understand the harbour, the colonies, the fleet, the famous Carthaginian negotiating reputation, and the particular energy of the market you are now entering. It is loud. It is varied in a way that reflects the reach of Carthaginian trade across the Mediterranean and beyond. Merchants who have come from Sardinia, from Spain, from Sicily, from the settlements along the Atlantic coast of Africa. Goods that include tin from further north than most people can easily imagine, ivory from the interior of the continent, saltfish from the Atlantic waters, grain from the fertile Libyan hinterland behind the city, gold dust in sealed containers that are handled with a care disproportionate to their size. The stalls are not organised in the way that might make sense from a planning perspective. They are organised in the way that happens when trade has been happening in a place for a very long time and everyone knows where everything is except you. You are looking for grain, not because you are a merchant, not today, but because the household supply is running lower than comfortable, and prices have been shifting in ways that make this a moment to act rather than wait. You have a specific sense of what you want to pay, based on what you have been paying, and that number is about to be challenged by someone who has done this considerably longer than you, and is already watching your face for information. The grain seller is a man of middle years with the kind of unhurried patience that comes from having done something professionally for a very long time. He stands behind his sacks in the particular posture of someone who is entirely comfortable with the next several minutes of their life. He knows you need grain. You know he knows. He knows you know he knows. This is the standard starting position. He names a price. You make a sound that communicates what you think of that price without using any specific words. He adjusts slightly, fractionally, in a way that suggests this adjustment is costing him something personal. You adjust slightly. This continues for a period of time that is longer than you would like, but shorter than he could make it if he chose to. And you walk away with grain and a depleted sense of personal negotiating power, and the persistent feeling that something happened in that exchange that you did not fully understand. This is the rhythm of Carthaginian daily commerce. Everything is negotiated. Everything has a price that is different from the price you will actually pay. The system rewards those who know the market, who understand what things actually cost, who can read the subtle signals of supply and scarcity, who have the patience to wait and the judgment to know when waiting has stopped being strategic and started being expensive. It is an economy built on information as much as goods, and those who move through it most successfully are those who know what others do not, or at least what others believe they do not. Around the grain cellar, the market continues at full intensity. A woman arguing with a cloth merchant about the quality of a dye lot, with the specific technical authority of someone who has been evaluating cloth her entire adult life and will not be moved by commercial enthusiasm. Two men in what appears to be a disagreement about the terms of some previous transaction, their voices at a level that draws glances but not intervention, because this kind of discussion is simply part of the ambient sound of a working market. A child running an errand with the focused purposefulness of someone who has been told exactly what to get and exactly what to pay, and is determined to report success. An older man sitting very still at a small stall selling spices from the east, saffron and pepper and cinnamon bark, priced at levels that communicate clearly that these are not everyday purchases, and watching the market around him with the attentive calm of someone who has nothing to prove and considerable experience of how these things go. You take your grain back toward the residential streets, and this gives you a chance to notice the buildings more carefully. Carthaginian houses were built in a style that reflected Mediterranean practicality and something more specific to the city's own character. Multi-story construction, with the upper floors projecting slightly over the street in a way that provided shade at ground level, which was a genuine gift in a city that sits at a latitude where the summer sun is not playing around. The ground floors of many buildings were given over to shops, workshops or storage, with the living quarters above. This arrangement meant the street itself was rarely purely residential. You could be walking through what looked like a neighbourhood and suddenly pass a dye works, a bakery that had been operating since before anyone currently alive was born, or a workshop where craftspeople worked bronze or bone or wood in the same space where their children were running around underfoot, and the smell of the craft materials competed with the smell of the midday cooking on the upper floor. The houses of wealthier Carthaginians were organised around interior courtyards, keeping the household's life private from the street, while allowing air to circulate through the building during the hottest parts of the day. Mosaic floors in the more prosperous homes, geometric patterns in the Punic style, some showing the influence of Greek and Egyptian decorative traditions, in the way that a wealthy trading city inevitably accumulates the aesthetic preferences of the cultures it does business with, painted plaster on the walls, furniture that reflected the city's access to imported timber and skilled craft workers, storage jars of Carthaginian manufacture, and also foreign ceramics that arrived as part of trade and remained as part of daily life. The gap between a wealthy Carthaginian household and a poor one was significant and visible, and the city did not particularly try to obscure this. Carthage had a social structure that will feel familiar to anyone who has spent time thinking about ancient commercial cities. At the top, the great merchant families whose wealth came from trade, whose influence shaped policy, and whose connections extended across the Mediterranean through business relationships, political alliances, and the particular kind of loyalty that is maintained by mutual profit. These families had names that appeared on dedications at the temples, on the stele in the Tophet, in the records of political decisions. They had houses on the Bursa or near it, where the air was slightly better, and the view was considerably better, and the symbolic language of elevation communicated everything that needed to be communicated about their position. Below them, a substantial middle layer of smaller merchants, skilled craftspeople, ship owners, and the various specialised professionals that a large commercial city generates. Doctors and scribes and priests and interpreters and harbour pilots, and the dozens of other specialised roles that urban life requires. Below that, the labourers, the servants, and the enslaved population, which was significant, as it was in all ancient Mediterranean cities of comparable scale. Carthage also had a large population of Libyans, the indigenous North African people of the region, who occupied a complicated position in relation to the city. Some lived within Carthage itself, some in the agricultural hinterland that supplied the city with food, and some in territories that were politically subject to Carthage in ways that generated a recurring low-level tension and occasionally something considerably more serious. The city was not a monoculture. It was a layered, complicated, commercially driven urban environment where multiple languages were spoken, multiple religious traditions coexisted in various states of tolerance, and the primary organising principle was economic interest rather than ethnic solidarity. The midday heat arrives with the kind of decisiveness that makes you understand why Mediterranean civilizations historically organised their days around avoiding it. The sun in late summer over Carthage is not a suggestion. It is a statement of position. The streets, already warm from the stone that has been absorbing heat since before dawn, now radiate back what they have stored. Your sandals feel inadequate. The back of your neck disagrees with recent decisions. You find shade where you can, which in the dense residential quarters of the city is not difficult. The narrow streets and overhanging upper stories doing the architectural work that trees do in other environments. You drink water, which in Carthage was a more complicated matter than you might expect. The city had cisterns, large and engineered with the same seriousness that Carthage applied to infrastructure it considered important. Rainwater was collected and stored in systems that served both public and private needs. There were also sources in the surrounding area, springs and wells that the city had been drawing on since its foundation. The great cisterns at Megara, the upper city area, were impressive enough that later occupiers of the site found them worth maintaining. But water in a large ancient city was never entirely free of the complications of proximity to too many people, too many animals, and too much organic material in general. You drink and you try not to think about the process by which this water arrived in its current container, because thinking about it is not going to improve it and is going to make you feel worse. The afternoon brings a different rhythm. The commercial intensity of the morning softens slightly. Workshops continue. The harbour does not rest. The smells continue at full strength, possibly slightly intensified by the accumulated heat of the day pressing down on everything simultaneously. But the social life of the city begins to reorient. People gather in the shade to talk, which in Carthage means talking about commerce, about ships, about who has what and what it cost and what it will be worth when it arrives somewhere else. Gossip in a trading city is not fundamentally different from gossip anywhere else. It is just that the currency of gossip is often literally currency, and so even the casual conversations of the afternoon carry a weight of information that matters in practical ways. You listen more than you speak. You have learned this. In a city where information is the primary commodity, and everyone is evaluating what you know versus what you're letting on, speaking too freely about your own situation is the kind of habit that the experienced Carthaginian merchant abandoned early in their career. You nod, you ask occasional questions, you absorb. This is how you learn the price of grain before you need to buy it. This is how you learn which ships have arrived with what cargo before the news becomes general. This is how the city works in layers, with the most useful information sitting slightly below the surface of the public conversation, accessible to those who know how to listen. The political life of the city is something you exist within rather than participate in directly. Carthage had a system of government that Greek observers found interesting to describe and difficult to categorize. Aristotle admired it, which is not a remark you can make about many ancient constitutions. There was a council of elders, a body of wealthy and influential citizens who held considerable power over long-term policy. There were elected magistrates, the suffet, 2 of them, who held executive authority and were re-elected annually in a system that distributed power rather than concentrating it in a single person. There was a popular assembly that could, in theory, exert influence over major decisions. In practice, the great merchant families dominated policy in the way that great families in commercial cities tend to do, when they have been rich long enough and organised enough to work the system from the inside. The Court of 104, a judicial body that oversaw military commanders and could hold the powerful accountable, added another layer of institutional complexity that kept any single faction from accumulating unchecked authority. It was a system designed by people who understood what power does when it is left unsupervised, which is to say, people who had thought carefully about the matter and arrived at cautious conclusions. You do not have a seat on any of these bodies. Your voice in the politics of Carthage is approximately the voice you have in the weather, which is to say you observe it, you respond to it, and you have no meaningful input into what it does next. This is fine. Most people in Carthage were in the same position, and the city functioned anyway, because the city's primary business was not governance but trade, and trade had its own mechanisms that ran alongside and sometimes underneath the official political structures. The evening comes more gently than the day. The heat releases slowly, the way it does in coastal cities where the sea remembers everything and returns it at a slightly different rate. The harbour shifts register, the commercial traffic of the day giving way to the particular nighttime energy of a port, which has its own rhythms and its own population. Sailors who have been working since before dawn are now sitting in the small taverns near the harbour, drinking the wine of whatever port most recently impressed them, and discussing it in the specific comparative way of people for whom wine is partly a professional category. Merchants settling accounts, verifying cargo inventories, writing letters that will travel on tomorrow's ships to trading partners in Utica or Hadrumatum or Motya. You eat in the early evening, something cooked rather than assembled this time, a stew of lentils with olive oil and herbs, thyme and some other green thing whose name you have not yet learned in the local variety. Bread that is better than this morning's in the way that fresh bread toward the end of the day is often better than bread at the beginning of it. Wine that has been mixed with water in the proportions that custom and personal judgment dictate, which for you tonight means more water than custom strictly requires, because the day has been long and your judgment is accordingly conservative. You sit on the steps of your building as the light goes, listening to the city not quite quiet down. Carthage does not fully quiet down, it adjusts. The market is gone, but its aftermath is still in the air, the residual smell of 1,000 transactions, the settling dust, the sounds of animals being led back to wherever they sleep. Somewhere not far off, music from a gathering you cannot quite see, a stringed instrument and a voice that carries more clearly in the cooler evening air. The harbour is still lit. It is always lit, in some version of itself. Ships arrive at night and the harbour receives them, because commerce does not observe the same hours as sleep, and the tides and winds that determine arrival times do not consult the city's preferences. From where you sit, you can see the lights of the harbour district reflected in the water, and the larger darkness beyond it that is the open gulf, and further still, the darkness that is the sea, which connects Carthage to everything it needs and everything it fears and everything it has built its greatness upon. You try to assess what this day cost and what it gave back. The grain is secured. The navigation of the market left you slightly depleted in ways that are difficult to quantify. Your back still has opinions about last night. The city fed you, housed you, moved around you in its particular loud and purposeful way, and asked nothing of you today except that you keep up and pay attention, and not slow anyone else down by stopping in the wrong place at the wrong moment. Tomorrow it will do the same, and the day after that, and the day after that. The city does not change its fundamental nature to accommodate newcomers. It presents itself fully formed and expects accommodation to flow in one direction. But somewhere underneath the noise and the smell and the relentless commercial energy, there is something about it that you have already begun to understand in a way that you could not have predicted. The intensity is not only exhausting, it is also alive in a way that quieter places are not, in the way that any city is alive that has organised its entire existence around the movement of things across the world. Carthage is not comfortable, it is not gentle, it does not apologise for what it is. But what it is, even on a difficult morning with a complaining back and a negotiation you probably lost, is something that has been built by people who believed absolutely in the project they were engaged in. And there is something to be said for being in a place that believes in itself. And yet there is something about Carthage that the morning does not fully reveal, something that only becomes clear later, as you spend more time inside it and begin to understand what the city is actually doing with all of this noise and energy and commerce. Carthage is not simply a city that trades. It is a city that thinks about trade in the way that other civilizations think about war or agriculture or divine power, as the central organizing principle of existence, the thing around which everything else is arranged. The temples serve commerce. The political structure serves commerce. The military serves commerce. Even the gods, in some sense, serve commerce, because what the Carthaginian merchant asks of Baal Hamon and Tanit is favourable conditions, safe passage, successful negotiation, the return of what was sent out. The sacred and the commercial are not separate categories here. They are aspects of the same project. You understand this more fully as the afternoon develops and the city moves through its middle hours with a kind of institutional purposefulness that feels less like a collection of individuals making individual decisions and more like a single organism following a logic that everyone has internalized. The Carthaginian did not need to be told that trade was important. That conviction was transmitted through the architecture, through the harbour, through the education of children into the family business before they were old enough to have formed opinions about whether they wanted to be merchants, through the religious calendar that organised the year around festivals that were also commercial events. The city made merchants the way other civilizations made soldiers or priests, by treating merchanthood as the natural adult state of a person, and organising everything around the assumption that this was what people did. The question of what this cost the city is one that the Carthaginians themselves probably did not frame as a question. The cost was not legible to them as a cost. A city that sends its sailors to sea in wooden vessels through Mediterranean storms is a city that accepts the loss of sailors as a condition of doing business. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. A city that employs mercenary armies rather than citizen soldiers is a city that has decided the cost of professional soldiers is worth the benefit of citizens remaining available for commerce. These are rational calculations in a framework that values trade above other things. The rationality of the framework is not in question from the inside. From the inside, it simply is what it is, which is everything. The women of Carthage appear in the historical record far less often than the men, which is the usual condition in ancient sources, and when they appear it is often through the lens of the male observers who considered them worth recording. There are wealthy Carthaginian women who controlled significant property, who appear in documentary records as landowners and businesswomen in their own right. The Punic legal tradition permitted women certain rights over property that varied across different periods and were more or less extensive depending on specific circumstances. There are priestesses in the Carthaginian religious structure who held positions of genuine institutional authority. There are women who appear in the dedicatory inscriptions of the Tophet, making offerings alongside or independent of their husbands, their names preserved in stone in the way that the names of the nameless are preserved, which is imperfectly but durably. The daily life of a Carthaginian woman of the middling sort, the wife of a skilled craftsman or a small merchant, would have revolved around the household in the way that ancient Mediterranean female experience revolved around the household, managing food production and storage, textile work, the supervision of children and servants if they existed, the maintenance of the religious observances that were conducted within the domestic sphere rather than at the public temples. But in a city whose domestic sphere was so thoroughly penetrated by the commerce happening on its ground floors, in the workshops that occupied the street level of residential buildings, in the trading houses that were simultaneously family residences and business operations, the boundary between the domestic and the commercial was considerably more permeable than it would have been in a city organised around different principles. You think about all of this in the late afternoon, sitting on the steps with the wine that is mostly water, watching the street resume its diminished version of the morning's activity. A child is carrying something for someone, moving with the practiced efficiency of a child who has been given this errand regularly. Two older men are having a conversation that seems to have been going on for some time, one of them occasionally gesturing toward the harbour, in the way that people in port cities gesture toward harbours when they are discussing something that happened there. A woman is negotiating with a water carrier for a second jug, her voice calm and precise in the way of someone who has established the terms of this transaction before and is simply confirming them for today. The city makes you a participant in it whether you volunteer for that role or not. That is what cities do. You arrived as an observer and you have become, through the ordinary mechanics of needing to eat and drink and sleep and move from one place to another, a functional component of the system. The grain seller has registered you as a customer. The landlord has registered you as a tenant. The harbour officials have registered you as a resident. The city knows you exist in the pragmatic, administrative way that cities know things, which is that they have figured out how to extract from you what they extract from everyone, and they will continue to do so until you leave or stop being extractable. This is not entirely cynical. The city also gives back. The harbour that smells so aggressively at dawn is also the harbour that connects this street, this room, this morning cup of watery wine to the trade networks that bring tin from the far north and ivory from the far south and silk and spices from the far east and make them available in a market 3 streets away. The density and noise of the residential quarters is also the density and noise of a place where help is close when you need it, where the person upstairs can hear you through the floor, where the baker who sells you bread in the morning knows your face by the end of the first week. Ancient cities were not comfortable by modern standards. They were also not lonely in the ways that modern arrangements can be lonely. The proximity was inescapable, and was also, in its own way, a form of community. You think about the people who built this place, who chose this peninsula in the Gulf of Tunis and decided it was worth everything it would take to make a city here. They understood something that is still true, that a good harbour at a strategic location is worth more than almost anything else on Earth if you are in the business of moving things across the world. They built the circular harbour, which ancient sources describe in terms that make clear it was impressive, even to people who had seen impressive harbours elsewhere. They built the bursa, the citadel, the temples, the residential quarters spreading out from the centre, with the logic of a place that knows it is going to keep growing and needs the infrastructure to support that growth. They built cisterns large enough to supply a city through a dry season. They built walls massive enough that the Romans needed 3 years to breach them. They built something that lasted, not forever, but for 5 centuries, which is a longer run than most human projects achieve, and if the end was violent and the ending was total, the thing that ended was still, for 5 centuries, one of the most consequential civilizations the Mediterranean world ever produced. The night comes and the city does not quite stop. You lie on your mat, which is still not quite right, and you listen to the harbour, which continues below you in its nighttime register, and you think that you have been here long enough now to stop being surprised by it, and not quite long enough to take it for granted. That is a specific position, the position of someone who has arrived somewhere, and is still in the process of deciding what they think about it, which is also the best position for actually seeing it clearly. Before the habit of place settles over you and makes everything familiar, there is a window of genuine perception, when the strangeness of a place is still present and the understanding of it is growing. You are in that window now. The city is being understood, gradually, the way any large and complicated thing is understood, which is incompletely and in pieces, and with the persistent sense that the most important parts are still just out of view. Tomorrow will add something. The day after that will add something else. Over time, if you stay, it will become ordinary, because all places become ordinary to those who live in them long enough. The extraordinary becomes the background. But tonight it is still strange enough to be interesting. And interesting, in a city this alive, is its own kind of comfort. The question of education in Carthage is one of the places where the historical record grows thin and speculation fills the gap. What the Phoenician tradition transmitted was practical, commercial, oriented toward the skills that a trading civilization needed its people to have. Writing, because written records were the infrastructure of long-distance commerce, contracts, inventories, letters, the administrative documentation of a trading house stretched across the Mediterranean. Arithmetic, for obvious reasons. The knowledge of goods, their qualities, their sources, their values in different markets. The knowledge of people, how to negotiate, how to read the intentions behind an offer, how to structure an agreement that would hold under the pressures that agreements face when large amounts of money are involved. These were the things that Carthaginian children of the merchant families were learning, not in institutions that resembled later schools, but in the way that craft knowledge has always been transmitted, through proximity to practitioners, through being in the room where it happened before you were old enough to participate, through the assumption that you would inherit this work and needed to understand it from the inside before you were given responsibility for any part of it. The Carthaginians also had contact with Greek educational traditions through the generations of interaction with Greek civilization in Sicily and across the Western Mediterranean. Certain Greek philosophical and mathematical traditions were accessible in Carthage, particularly in the later periods, through the educated Greek-speaking slaves and freedmen who served in elite households, through the cultural exchange that trade inevitably brings even when the trading partners are also competitors, through the simple fact that a city as commercially sophisticated as Carthage could not afford to be intellectually isolated from the broader Mediterranean world in which it operated. The agricultural treatise attributed to a Carthaginian named Mago, a work on farming methods that was considered valuable enough that the Roman Senate ordered it to be translated into Latin after the city's destruction, gives a glimpse of another side of Carthaginian intellectual life. The Punic tradition of systematic agricultural knowledge, the management of the hinterland that supplied the city with food, the cultivation of olives and vines and grain in the particular conditions of the North African climate, This was also a form of knowledge that was accumulated and refined over generations and transmitted in ways that clearly involved more than simple oral tradition. Mago's work was large enough and detailed enough to be considered a significant reference by Roman writers on agriculture, which suggests that Carthaginian agricultural knowledge was not merely practical, but had been systematized and recorded at a level of sophistication that implied a genuine intellectual tradition. All of this existed inside the city you're walking through, layered beneath the commerce and the noise, not always visible but present in the way that the intellectual life of any civilization is present, in the training that shapes how people see problems, in the assumptions that determine what questions are worth asking, in the frameworks that determine what counts as a good answer. The Carthaginian who negotiated your grain price this morning was applying a framework for valuing goods, assessing risk, reading social situations, and extracting optimal outcomes from competitive interactions that had been refined over generations, and was as sophisticated, in its domain, as any intellectual tradition the ancient world produced. It just happened to be a tradition primarily aimed at commerce rather than philosophy, at outcomes rather than contemplation, at what works rather than what is true in a more abstract sense. This is not a criticism. Every civilization's intellectual tradition reflects what that civilization most needs to think about carefully. The Carthaginians thought carefully about trade, and the result was an economic sophistication that sustained a major Mediterranean power for 5 centuries. The Greeks thought carefully about philosophy and politics, and produced traditions that are still foundational to the way much of the modern world reasons about these things. The Romans thought carefully about law and administration, and produced institutions whose influence can be traced to the present day. None of these traditions fully comprehended the others. Each was a genuine achievement in its own domain. The accident of which tradition survived, and whose destruction was chosen, should not be mistaken for a judgment about which civilizations had the most to offer. The woman at the centre of Carthage's founding is one of those historical figures who exists in the uncertain territory between documented fact and shaped mythology, and the difficulty of separating the two is itself part of the story. She's called Dido in the Roman tradition, Elissa in the Phoenician, and depending on which source you consult and which century it comes from, she's either a brilliantly resourceful political refugee who built a city through intelligence and strategic thinking, or a tragic queen who destroyed herself for love, or both, or neither, or something more complicated than either version is willing to admit. What the ancient sources generally agree on is this. She was a Phoenician princess from Tyre, one of the great trading cities of the Levantine coast, a city that had been building wealth and influence across the Mediterranean for centuries before Carthage existed. The Phoenicians were the maritime civilization of the ancient world at this period, builders of ships and establishers of colonies from the coast of modern Lebanon westward through Cyprus, Malta, Sicily, Sardinia, Spain, and along the Atlantic coast of North Africa. They carried a culture of commerce and craft and urban sophistication to places that had known neither, and they did so with a purposefulness that reflected their understanding that controlling trade routes was the most reliable path to power in the ancient Mediterranean. Elissa was born into this tradition. She inherited its assumptions, and she would carry it further west than it had previously gone. Her father was king of Tyre. Her brother was Pygmalion, who would succeed him. The succession, as it worked out, was not peaceful, and her husband was a man named Acabas, or Zacchaeus in the Roman telling of things, a man of high priestly office and considerable accumulated wealth. He was, in the way of wealthy men in cities where a new king is establishing himself, and looking around to see what resources are available and who is holding them, vulnerable to the most immediate solution a new ruler can apply to the problem of someone else's wealth. Pygmalion killed him. The reasons vary in the different tellings. The wealth was wanted. The power was wanted. The man who held both was removed in the direct way that ancient power transitions sometimes resolved themselves. And Elissa was left in a position that required a decision, specifically the kind of decision you have to make when the person who just murdered your husband is also your brother and is also the most powerful person in the city and controls the harbour and the ships and the men who crew them. She left. This is either the most straightforward part of the story or the most complex, depending on how much you think about what it actually took to organise and execute the departure of a significant group of people from a major Phoenician city without the knowledge or permission of the ruler who had recently demonstrated his willingness to solve problems violently, She assembled followers, people who had their own reasons to prefer a different arrangement, senators of Tyre who found the new king's methods concerning, servants, retainers, and others whose loyalty was to her rather than her brother. She took ships, which means she either already had access to vessels, or she acquired that access through negotiations that the sources do not fully detail. She took whatever of Akabas's wealth she could carry, which according to some accounts involved a certain amount of strategic misdirection of her brother's men, who were sent to intercept her and were told, with apparent sincerity, that she was bringing tribute when she was in fact bringing her own people, and their goods, and their future somewhere that Pygmalion could not follow. The departure from Tyre was not the end of the journey. Ancient sources describe stops along the way, Cyprus being the most detailed. In Cyprus she acquired priests of the goddess Astarte, the divine patron who would travel with the colony, and according to some versions also a number of young women who were to serve as companions or wives for the colonists. The stop in Cyprus also represented an act of practical logistics, restocking for a longer voyage, establishing a relationship with a community that could be useful. Alyssa understood trade. She understood that a journey has legs and each leg has its own requirements. The route she took brought her eventually to the coast of North Africa, to the Gulf of Tunis, to a location that had everything a Phoenician trader looked for in a settlement site. A natural harbour with access from the sea and protection from the worst weather, access to the interior through river valleys and trade routes, a position that commanded the shipping lanes between the eastern and western Mediterranean, a position so strategically significant that whoever controlled it controlled the movement of everything that passed between them. High ground for defence, fertile agricultural land in the immediate hinterland that could sustain a population without total dependence on imported food. The Phoenicians were not sentimental about where they built their trading posts. They were systematic, even clinical, in their evaluation of potential sites. And Alyssa, who had been trained inside one of the most successful trading cultures in the ancient world, understood the system completely and applied it without hesitation. There were already people there. The Berber tribes of the North African coast had their own relationship with this land, their own political structures, their own understanding of what the harbour and the hinterland were worth. Any incoming settlement had to deal with this reality. The story of how Alyssa dealt with it is famous enough to have given Latin a phrase. She asked the local Berber king, named Iabas or Hiabas in most versions, for as much land as a hide could cover. He agreed, presumably because this sounded like a harmless and rather small request from a foreign woman who had just arrived with ships and followers and no particular leverage. She then cut the hide into the thinnest possible strips, working with a patience and a geometric precision that the story does not dwell on but that clearly required both, creating a continuous line long enough to enclose the hill that would become the Byrsa, the citadel at the heart of Carthage. Whether this happened exactly as described is a matter for scholars to debate with great energy and very little chance of resolution. Folklore traditions across many cultures contain versions of this same narrative, the clever newcomer who acquires more land than the local authority intended through ingenious interpretation of the agreed terms. The story carries a pattern that suggests it may be a type of tale applied to founders rather than a precise historical account. What it communicates, regardless of its literal truth, is something specific about how Carthage wanted to remember its founder: clever, resourceful, willing to work within the rules of an agreement while understanding those rules more completely than the other party did, operating not through force, which she did not have, but through intelligence, which she had in abundance. The city that grew from this act was initially called Carthage in Phoenician, which means simply new city, a name that reflected its status as a fresh establishment rather than an ancient one. It was not the only Phoenician settlement in the region. Utica was older and would be its rival and then its subordinate. Other Phoenician trading posts dotted the North African coast. But something about this particular site, and something about the community that had established itself there, would eventually differentiate Carthage from all of them. The local ruler was not, apparently, entirely pleased with how the hide situation worked out. He wanted more than a trade relationship from the new arrivals. He wanted Alyssa. He proposed marriage, and when the word marriage is used in this context in an ancient text about a Phoenician queen and a North African king, it means something considerably more politically loaded than the word suggests on its surface. He had resources, territory, and the people to defend them. She had a city that was newly built and dependent on local tolerance for its survival. a fleet that was useful but not unlimited, and a community that had followed her across the sea and now looked to her for the judgment that had brought them this far. She refused. The exact manner of her refusal depended on the tradition. In some accounts she was simply resolute, meeting his proposal with a combination of diplomatic respect and absolute finality that left no practical avenue for escalation. In others she delayed with promises she never intended to keep, buying time in the way that political leaders have always bought time, when the situation required it, making the future seem more flexible than the present, while the present was consolidated. In still others, the pressure became so intense and the political situation so difficult that she made a decision that was either an act of profound devotion to her dead husband or a political calculation dressed as religious devotion, or both things simultaneously in the way that ancient queens sometimes managed to be both things at once. She built a pyre. The stated reason was a ritual sacrifice, a final ceremony of mourning for Asubas before she could consider any future attachment. This was a comprehensible religious act in the ancient Mediterranean world, where the boundaries between civic ritual, personal devotion, and political statement were not sharply drawn, where a public ceremony of mourning was a public statement about loyalty and identity, where the gods were witnesses to human commitments in a way that made those commitments binding in ways that purely secular agreements were not. Her city gathered to watch, and then she climbed it, and she died. The meaning of this act has been argued over ever since. Was it genuine? Was it strategic? A way of making herself permanently unavailable to Yabas while avoiding the political consequences of a direct refusal? Was it both, as human decisions made under extreme pressure often are both sincere and calculated, genuine in the feeling that drives them, and rational in the form they take? We cannot know. The sources that describe it are not unanimous in tone or detail, and the events they describe happened in a time and place from which almost no native Carthaginian voice survives. The Roman poet Virgil took this story and rewrote it 4 centuries after the fact in a way that would become enormously influential, and has also, for many readers, somewhat obscured the earlier tradition. In the Aeneid, Dido falls in love with the Trojan hero Aeneas, who arrives in Carthage on his way to found Rome. He loves her. He leaves her because the gods require it, because destiny requires it, because Rome has not yet been founded, and Aeneas's primary obligation is to the future rather than the present. She dies on the pyre in grief and rage, having built something beautiful and then watched it unmade by something she could not fight. It is one of the most moving passages in Latin literature, and it has shaped how the Western tradition has understood this woman for 2,000 years. But it was written by a Roman poet in the service of Roman literary and political purposes at a specific moment in Roman history, when the Emperor Augustus was consolidating power and wanted a founding narrative that connected Roman greatness to divine will and historical inevitability. Dido in Virgil is a tragic figure whose tragedy serves, among other purposes, to explain and justify the Punic Wars, to frame the historical enmity between Rome and Carthage as something fated, rooted in a divine wound, in a love that was real and then violated. This is a useful story for Rome. It explains the otherwise difficult fact that Rome eventually did something to Carthage that goes considerably beyond military defeat. The Alyssa of the earlier tradition did not die for a man. She died, if the story is taken seriously, rather than submit to a political situation that would have dissolved everything she had built, that would have made the city she had created a dependent of a local ruler rather than an independent trading power, that would have transformed the project she had carried across the sea from Tyre into something that answered to someone else. She died, in other words, on her own terms. This is a very different kind of story than the one Virgil tells. Carthage remembered her as a founder, as a sacred figure, possibly as a goddess or a deified ancestor. Coins from the later Carthaginian period show female figures that may reference her or may reference Tanit, and the line between a revered founder and a divine presence in ancient religious thought was not always a firm one. The city that grew from her landing on that North African coastline would become one of the wealthiest and most powerful cities in the ancient Mediterranean world, controlling sea routes that no other power could effectively challenge for centuries, establishing colonies from Spain to Sardinia to Sicily, building a fleet that made the Western Mediterranean a Carthaginian sea in the way that any sea is owned by whoever has the ships to patrol it. It would produce generals whose names are still recognized today. Hannibal Barca crossed the Alps with war elephants and devastated the Roman army at Trebia and Lake Trasimene and Cannae, winning battles that military historians still use as case studies in tactical genius. His father Hamilcar had fought Rome to a standstill in Sicily before political settlement forced a withdrawal that Hamilcar never accepted as final. These men came from a military tradition that was not the centre of Carthaginian identity, but that the city could produce with remarkable effectiveness when the situation demanded it. The situation eventually demanded more than even Hannibal could provide. 3 Punic Wars and almost a century and a half of conflict ended in 146 before the Common Era, with a Roman force that had been instructed that Carthage must be destroyed. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. A directive so blunt in its formulation that the Roman senator Cato is remembered to history primarily for repeating it at the end of every speech, regardless of what the speech was ostensibly about. The Romans besieged the city for 3 years. When they finally entered it, they fought through the streets building by building for 6 days. They enslaved the survivors, perhaps 50,000 people, from a city that had held perhaps 250,000. They burned what could be burned and demolished what could not. The story about salting the earth so nothing would grow there is probably not historically accurate in the literal sense. Rome wanted the site for agriculture eventually, not permanent desolation. But it captures something emotionally true about the intention. This was not simply military defeat. This was erasure. She did not live to see any of it, according to any version of the story. She built the foundation, and she died on it, in circumstances that were either tragic or triumphant, or the specific kind of thing that happens when a woman of considerable intelligence and political skill is placed in an impossible situation and refuses to find it acceptable. Her city was eventually erased. Her story survived the erasure and continued to be told by the very people who ordered the erasure, which is its own kind of endurance. 3,000 years later, people are still arguing about who she was, what she actually did, and what it means that the city she founded became one of the most consequential civilizations the Mediterranean world ever produced. That is not a bad legacy for someone who arrived with a fleet of ships, a cut hide, and the particular kind of determination that tends to make the people in charge of the territory very nervous about what she might do next. But to understand Alyssa properly, you have to understand Tyre, because she's not comprehensible apart from the civilization that produced her. Tyre was not merely a city. It was, at the period of her life, one of the centres of the commercial world, a Phoenician city-state built on a rocky island just off the Levantine coast, connected to the mainland by a causeway that was artificial and vulnerable, and an island location that was both a commercial advantage and a military one. It traded with Egypt, with Cyprus, with the Aegean world, with the merchants of Mesopotamia. Its craftspeople worked ivory and gold and purple cloth with a skill that made Tyrian products recognizable and valued across the ancient world. Its sailors knew routes that other peoples could not navigate. Its merchants negotiated in multiple languages with a fluency that came from doing it every day in every direction. Into this world, Alyssa was born with the advantages and the vulnerabilities of her position. A princess was a political asset, which meant she had value but not autonomy, that her future was a resource to be allocated by whoever held power, that the marriage that gave her Acabas was itself a political act, and the murder that took him from her was another political act in the same sequence. The Phoenician world was not notably worse than its contemporaries in the treatment of royal women as instruments of alliance and inheritance management. It was simply the world as it was organised at the time, and Alyssa existed within it until the moment she decided not to. That decision, when it came, was not impulsive. The preparation she made before departing suggests someone who had been thinking about this possibility, or something like it, for some time before the moment arrived. You do not organise a significant group of followers, secure ships, arrange for provisions, and navigate the politics of a departure in a way that outwits a king's men without having done considerable planning in advance of the crisis. The crisis gave her the moment, the preparation gave her the ability to use it. The route from Tyre to Carthage passed through familiar Phoenician waters. The Phoenicians had been establishing trading posts and colonies across the Mediterranean for centuries, following the routes that their seamen had mapped and the locations that their traders had identified as commercially viable. Cyprus was within the established Phoenician sphere. The settlements along the Libyan coast were known. The Gulf of Tunis was not terra incognita. Alyssa was not sailing blindly into the unknown. She was making a choice within a known framework, selecting a destination that her Phoenician background gave her the knowledge to evaluate, a place where Phoenician culture and Phoenician commercial methods would have a foundation to build on, because the infrastructure of maritime trade was already present, at least in outline, along the routes she was following. The Berber populations of North Africa were not unknown to the Phoenicians either. There had been trade and contact between the Levantine maritime civilization and the peoples of the North African coast for generations before Carthage was founded. Alyssa arrived not as someone dropping from the sky into an alien landscape, but as a Phoenician in territory that had some existing relationship with the Phoenician world, which made the negotiation she had to conduct, including the famous negotiation about the hide, the kind of negotiation that someone with commercial and diplomatic training might manage rather than a miracle that required special divine assistance. This does not make her less remarkable. It makes her more so, in the sense that her achievement becomes more legible when it is understood as the application of real skills to a real situation, rather than a legendary act that exists outside the realm of ordinary human capability. She used what she knew. She applied the methods of the civilization she came from to a new context. She had the judgment to choose a site that would sustain what she was trying to build, the diplomatic skill to negotiate the terms of settlement, the organizational capacity to manage a community of refugees and political exiles, and shape them into a functioning civic entity. These are not small things. They are, in fact, the things that found cities, and most cities do not have a founder whose story is told at all. The Carthage that grew from her landing would face challenges almost immediately that would have tested any founding community. The relationship with the indigenous Berber populations had to be managed continuously, a combination of trade relationships, political negotiations, and occasional military confrontation that the city navigated over centuries with varying degrees of success and varying degrees of justice. The relationship with other Phoenician settlements, particularly Utica, which was older and initially more established, had to be carefully managed as Carthage grew and began to overshadow its predecessors. The relationship with the broader Mediterranean world, with the Greeks who were also expanding westward, with the Etruscans who controlled significant territories in what is now central Italy, with the Iberian peoples of the peninsula that would become Spain, all of these required a diplomacy and a strategic capacity that went considerably beyond what a simple trading post would have needed. The city that Alyssa founded developed that capacity. Carthage became, over the course of several centuries, something that had not existed when she landed, a genuinely imperial power in the ancient Mediterranean sense, controlling territories through a combination of direct governance, commercial relationship, and military dominance that extended from Tunisia across the North African coast, across the major islands of the Western Mediterranean, and into significant portions of the Iberian Peninsula. This transformation from trading post to empire was not instantaneous and not smooth. It involved setbacks and reversals and internal crises, including a series of mercenary revolts that came close to destroying the city from within. It involved the evolution of a Carthaginian military capability that the original Phoenician trading tradition had not emphasized, because fighting was something you hired professionals for, which worked until the professionals needed to be paid and the treasury was short. But the trajectory, across the 5 centuries from founding to destruction, was one of growth, of increasing ambition and increasing reach, of a civilization that took the commercial foundation Alyssa had established and built upon it a political and military structure of genuine historical consequence. Hannibal Barca, who crossed the Alps and won 3 battles against Rome that military historians still study in detail, was the product of that civilization, trained in its military tradition, animated by his father's conviction that the terms Rome had imposed after the First Punic War were unacceptable and needed to be contested. He failed ultimately, not on any battlefield he commanded, but because Carthage could not sustain him at the distance his campaign required, because the political will that would have been needed to support his strategic vision was not fully present in the councils back home. He was the most brilliant general Carthage produced, and possibly one of the most brilliant generals the ancient world produced, and he returned to Carthage from his undefeated Italian campaigns to see the city eventually lose the war anyway, and be forced into terms that included the limitation of its military capacity. He lived to see the final defeat at Zama. He survived to become a Carthaginian political figure and then an exile when Rome demanded he be handed over. He died in Asia, refusing capture, a man whose capabilities exceeded the civilization that produced him, and who was ultimately let down not by any failure of personal genius, but by the structural limits of what Carthage was and was not willing to commit. The tragedy of Hannibal is partly a tragedy of Carthage, a civilization that built a man of extraordinary military talent and then could not fully support what he was capable of doing with it. And then there is the 3-year siege that ended it. The final period of Carthage is documented in Roman sources with a specificity that suggests Rome understood what it was doing and wanted the record to reflect that understanding. The siege was long because the city fought with everything it had. Streets were contested building by building. The harbour, that harbour that was the heart of everything, was fought over with the same intensity that the rest of the city was fought over. The survivors, tens of thousands of them, were enslaved. The Senator Cato had been saying for years that Carthage must be destroyed, and when the instruction was finally given, it was followed with a completeness that left almost nothing standing. The archaeological record of the final period of Carthage is one of violence and fire, of buildings collapsed under their own weight, of the material evidence of a city destroyed rather than abandoned. This is what it looks like when a civilization is ended deliberately rather than simply declining. The contrast with other ancient ruins is visible to archaeologists who work the site. This was not entropy. This was intention. What Alyssa founded was not supposed to end this way. Nothing is. But the way it ended, violently and completely, at the hands of people who had decided that the city's continued existence was incompatible with their own ambitions, is part of the story of what she built, because what she built was eventually significant enough to be considered a threat worth destroying. That is, in the grim accounting of ancient history, a measure of success. The morning you leave port, the harbour smells the way harbours always smell, which is to say it smells like commerce, which is to say it smells like fish and salt water and tar and the particular sour animal note of a vessel that has been at sea before and carries the history of those voyages in its timbers. You have been part of this enough times that the smell no longer bothers you, not in the immediate visceral way it bothered you the first time. Now it is simply the smell of departure, which is its own complicated feeling, something that is neither entirely good nor entirely bad, but is so consistently present at the beginning of voyages that you have stopped trying to categorize it and simply registered it as the signal that something is beginning. You are a merchant sailor in the service of a Carthaginian trading house, which means you are part of a system that is old enough and organized enough to have developed opinions about everything. Opinions about which routes are worth taking and which are not, which markets are favourable, and which have been spoiled by too many other Carthaginian traders undercutting each other until the margins disappeared. Opinions about which foreign merchants can be trusted to honour an agreement, and which of them have a particular understanding of what honouring an agreement means that differs from yours in inconvenient ways. Opinions about the weather, about the gods, about the right way to load an amphora, about the character of foreign merchants in terms that are probably less fair than they could be, but are repeated so consistently that they have acquired a kind of institutional permanence. You have absorbed most of these opinions simply by proximity. Some of them you have verified through experience. Some of them you hold because they were given to you, and you have not yet had reason to question them, and perhaps will not for some time yet. The ship you are sailing on is a merchant vessel of the type the Carthaginians had refined over generations of intensive seafaring, broader than a warship, built for carrying capacity rather than speed, but not slow, not ungainly, capable of performing adequately in conditions that would challenge something designed exclusively for one purpose. The Carthaginians called these vessels hippoi in the Greek form of the name, horse ships, though the exact reason for this is not entirely clear, possibly a reference to the figureheads, possibly something else. The hold is loaded with Carthaginian goods, purple-dyed cloth in quantities that represent considerable investment, ceramic goods of Carthaginian manufacture, metalwork, and several large sealed jars, whose contents you have been told are wine but which smell, through the seal, of something more complicated than wine, something that suggests a trading relationship with the interior of the continent, products moving through Carthage on their way to markets that the originating parties could not reach directly. You have learned not to ask detailed questions about the sealed jars. The answer involves trading relationships that predate your employment with this house by several decades, and the people who maintain those relationships prefer them to remain their own business. The crew is a mix of Carthaginians and hired hands from various other origins, which is normal. Carthage had been sailing these waters long enough to understand that practical seamanship mattered more than origin, and the sea has a way of making the question of where someone comes from feel less pressing than the question of whether they know what they are doing when the wind changes and the sail needs immediate and correct attention. You know most of these men. You know which ones to trust with a specific task and which ones to trust with nothing more demanding than pulling on a rope when told and being in the general location they were supposed to be when they were supposed to be there. You have opinions of your own now. This is how experience accumulates, in the specific, irreversible way that experience accumulates at sea, where the consequences of misjudgment are difficult to revisit once they have arrived. The departure is businesslike. The loading finished before dawn, in the darkness and lamplight of the harbour's pre-morning activity, the sailors working with the particular wordless efficiency of people who have done this enough times that the task does not require discussion, only attention. The harbour officials have been dealt with, which in Carthage means a series of interactions that are partly administrative, partly ritual, and partly the specific kind of business that harbour officials and trading houses conduct with each other in every port city in the ancient world, and which does not appear in any official record. The ship moves out of the commercial harbour into the open water of the Gulf with the slow, deliberate pace of a vessel that is carrying cargo and does not need to hurry to prove anything. The open water arrives and then the open sea. The Mediterranean in the ancient world was not the well-mapped, heavily trafficked, infrastructure-supported body of water it would become in later centuries. It was a place of genuine uncertainty, even for experienced sailors. A place where the difference between a good voyage and a disaster was a matter of timing, judgment, luck, and the specific behaviour of weather systems that nobody had yet developed a reliable system for predicting. The Carthaginians had more knowledge of it than almost anyone. Centuries of route-finding, colony-establishing, observation-accumulating seafaring that had produced navigational knowledge they guarded with genuine seriousness. There are ancient accounts suggesting that Carthaginian ships would sink foreign vessels that ventured into waters the Carthaginians considered their sphere of influence and their commercial monopoly, which is either propaganda from their enemies or a reasonable description of how a trading monopoly is maintained by the most direct method available, and these two possibilities are not mutually exclusive. But knowledge does not mean control, the sea controls. You learn this again every voyage in small ways and occasionally in ways that are not small at all. For the first several days, the sailing is what it should be. Wind from a cooperative direction, a sky that communicates its intentions clearly enough to be read without too much interpretation. A sea state that is demanding without being actively hostile. You fall into the particular rhythm of life aboard a working vessel, which has its own logic and its own hierarchy and its own way of organising time that bears almost no relationship to how time works on land. The captain's decisions are final in the way that decisions are final at sea, not because he has been given authority, but because the situation gives him authority automatically, because a vessel in open water with a crew making independent decisions is a vessel that has already begun to become a problem. You understand this and accept it. You have seen the alternative on other voyages. You did not enjoy it. Watches. The division of the crew into groups responsible for specific periods, maintaining the sail, watching the horizon, attending to the hull and the cargo, managing whatever the sea requires, managing at any given hour of the day or night. You take your watches as they come because the watch system does not accommodate personal preferences about which hours of the night feel most amenable to being awake. Sail adjustments, which on a working merchant vessel in the ancient Mediterranean are a constant negotiation with conditions that are never entirely stable. The navigation by stars and sun and the reading of wave patterns and bird behaviour, and the subtle colour changes of the water that tell experienced sailors things about depth and current and proximity to land. The Carthaginians had pilots whose knowledge of specific routes was detailed enough to be considered a professional specialty, men who knew where the hidden rocks were and where the currents ran in specific seasons, and which headlands produced dangerous wind effects that did not match what the broader conditions suggested. You're not yet one of those men. You're on the way toward being one, which means you're at the stage where you know enough to understand what you do not know, which is its own kind of progress. Meals are simple because the galley of a working merchant vessel is not interested in cuisine, only in fuel, and fuel in this context means dried meat, dried fish, hard bread, olives, and water that has been in the ship's containers long enough to have developed a character of its own. There is also wine, diluted in the Mediterranean fashion, which serves partly as a flavouring agent for water that would otherwise be difficult to drink with any enthusiasm. You eat what is given, and you think about the food that will be available at the destination, because looking forward to something that does not currently exist is one of the few available strategies for managing the immediate reality of what does, and it is a strategy that sailors have been employing since the first person decided to leave the shore in a vessel and discovered that the shore was further away than it looked. The destination for this voyage is a Carthaginian trading post on the coast of Sardinia, a relationship that the city had maintained for generations and which was commercially valuable in several directions simultaneously. Sardinia sat in the middle of the Western Mediterranean in a position that made it useful as a waypoint for longer voyages, as a source of particular local goods, including metals from the island's interior, grain from the fertile central plains, and as a market for Carthaginian manufactured goods in an area where the Carthaginian name carried sufficient weight to make negotiation move in a favourable direction. The Carthaginians had been in Sardinia since the 8th century before the Common Era, establishing a presence that had grown from trading post to settlement to a network of towns and agricultural territories that made Sardinia effectively a Punic island with an indigenous population that had its own complicated feelings about this arrangement. The trading post itself, when you reach it after a voyage that has taken longer than hoped because of winds that had their own plans that were not in alignment with yours, is a place that exists in the layered way of Carthaginian colonial establishments. There are Carthaginians here who have lived in this place long enough to have children who have never seen the city their parents came from, who speak Punic with an accent that is slightly different from the city accent, who have absorbed local words into their daily speech and local habits into their daily life, in the way that people inevitably absorb the environment they actually live in, rather than the one they came from. There are local Sardinians who work with the trading post in arrangements that are mutually workable, if not entirely symmetric, in terms of who gets more of what. There are goods flowing in both directions and a set of established procedures for how the exchange works that both parties understand well enough to execute without significant friction. Because significant friction is bad for business, and everyone here is, at the level of practical operation, primarily interested in business. The negotiation for your cargo takes the time it takes, which is longer than you would prefer. There are discussions about quality, about quantities, about the current state of demand in Carthage for specific categories of goods, about what the trading house will actually be able to move and at what price, discussions that unfold in the measured way of people who have done this before and know that the initial positions on both sides are starting points rather than conclusions. You participate in this process at the edges, listening more than speaking, noting how the senior men of your house conduct these discussions, where they show flexibility and where they do not, what they give away early and what they protect until the end, what information they let slip and what they withhold, because this too is knowledge that will eventually be worth having. You sell what you brought at a number that is acceptable without being satisfying, which is the normal outcome of these things, and the number that is not satisfying is compensated for by the return cargo, metal goods, and local agricultural products that will find a market in Carthage itself, or be redirected through the city's trading networks to somewhere else entirely. A profitable voyage is one where the sum of the decisions made on both ends adds up to something better than the alternative of having stayed home. This one will be profitable, not triumphantly but reliably, which is the target the house aims for on every voyage, because reliability over time is what builds the wealth that makes triumphant voyages possible when they occur. The return voyage is different from the outward one in the way that return voyages always are, which is to say that the psychological weight of it is lighter, even when the physical conditions are harder, even when the sea state is worse and the wind is less cooperative and the hours on watch feel longer. You are going back. Something in the body knows the direction of home and responds to it with a patience that the outward journey does not quite have. But the sea does not care about your feelings of direction. The storm hits on the third day of the return, which is, as storms go, not the worst time for it to happen, because you are not near land, and land during a storm is the specific thing that actually kills ships. Open water during a storm is terrifying and exhausting and violent, and it strains every system of the vessel and every system of the people on it, their muscles, their judgment, their capacity to make correct decisions while cold and wet and operating on insufficient sleep. It is not in itself necessarily fatal if the ship is sound, and the crew knows what it is doing, and the gods have not decided to attend to your particular vessel today for reasons of their own. You work. This is what there is to do during a storm on a working vessel. You work until your hands have no more grip in them, and then you find grip because the alternative to finding grip is being somewhere you do not want to be. The sail is managed, then the sail is abandoned as conditions pass the point where sail management becomes counterproductive. Then the sail situation is revisited as conditions shift again in the direction of merely terrible rather than actively dangerous. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The cargo shifts and must be addressed because shifted cargo in a storm changes the behaviour of the ship in ways that add new problems to the existing set of problems you are already managing. Water comes in from above and from the sides, and the bilge requires attention of a sustained and distinctly unglamorous kind that no one celebrates and no one avoids, because the bilge does not offer the option of avoidance. At some point in the night, when the storm is neither better nor worse than it has been for several hours, when you have been working for a period of time that you have stopped trying to calculate because calculating makes it worse, you have a moment of the specific clarity that exhaustion sometimes produces, the state where the mind is too tired for its normal activities and settles into a simpler, clearer register. You're aware of exactly where you are, which is in a wooden vessel on a hostile sea in darkness, cold and wet and sore in specific places that are rotating in their intensity so that your attention moves from the left shoulder to the right knee to the back of the neck, in a cycle that seems designed by something that finds this amusing. You are aware that this is what you do. This is the thing that the harbour and the market and the trade house and the purple cloth and the sealed jars are all built on. The sea that everyone in Carthage treats as the source of the city's greatness, the basis of its power and wealth and reach across the world. This is what the sea actually is. Not the harbour view from the upper window in the early morning light. This. The storm passes. They do, almost always, and almost always in a way that feels like it should have been obvious in retrospect that it would, even though it did not feel that way at any point during it. You emerge from it tired in ways that sleep will not fully address for several days, with a vessel that has its own opinions about what it has been through, and a crew that is quieter than it was before, not in a troubled way, just in the way that people are quiet after something that required everything they had, and left them with a very clear sense of what everything they had actually amounts to. There are voyages that do not end this way. The Carthaginian sea lanes carried an enormous volume of traffic over the centuries of the city's commercial dominance, and a significant portion of that traffic did not arrive. Ships lost in storms, to navigational errors in unfamiliar waters, to the violence of competitors who had their own ideas about who should be sailing where, to structural failures that the wooden construction of ancient vessels was always vulnerable to, regardless of the quality of the materials and the skill of the builders. The sea took what it took and the city absorbed the losses, and the trading houses calculated the risk into their margins, and the sailors understood, without it needing to be stated, that the sea made no promises. You signed on knowing this. The money reflected it. The risk was not hidden from you. The harbour of Carthage appears on the horizon in the late afternoon of a day that has been mild after the storm's violence, and you watch it grow from a distant line to a specific, familiar shape, the outline of the peninsula, the glint of the water in the harbours, the hill of the Burza above everything. Something releases in you that you did not know was held tight. You sail in past the outer markers, past the lighthouse, into the commercial harbour where the dock workers and the house agents are already moving toward the vessel before it has fully come to rest at the dock, because Carthage is always already moving, always calculating, always oriented toward the next thing, even before the current thing has finished. You step onto solid ground, and it does what solid ground always does after a sea voyage, which is to seem to move under your feet because your body has adjusted to the constant motion of the ship, and now the absence of motion feels like its own kind of sensation. You stand and you breathe and you smell the harbour, which smells the way it always smells, all of it. The fish sauce and the tar and the animal notes and the cooking fires of the district, and for all of your complicated feelings about Carthage, and you have them, a sailor cannot spend significant time at sea without developing complicated feelings about the city that sends him there and the city he returns to. For all of that, arriving here is, in its own qualified way, something. The sea took a great deal from you this voyage. The city will ask for its portion as well, the accounting of the cargo, the settlement of wages, the ordinary commerce of return. But the city at least does not try to drown you. That distinction matters more than it did before you left. But before you reach that harbour again, there are days at sea that are neither storm nor smooth sailing, days that are the main texture of any extended voyage, the days that nobody talks about when they talk about the sea, when conditions are manageable and the work is continuous and the hours pass without drama and without rest, because manageable and continuous is what the sea offers when it is feeling generous, which is not nothing but is also not what the romanticised version of seafaring suggests. You are 3 days out of the Sardinian port and the sky is grey and the wind is steady from a direction that is neither ideal nor impossible, requiring continuous adjustment to extract the best from it, requiring the attention of people who understand the relationship between the sail's angle and the ship's heading well enough to make dozens of small decisions correctly over the course of an hour. This is technical work. It does not look dramatic, but it is the difference between arriving somewhere and not arriving, between a profitable voyage and a voyage that burned through its supplies and made nothing. You work the sail because this is your watch, and because the alternative, a sail that is poorly managed by someone who is doing something else or thinking about something else, costs everyone on the vessel something they cannot afford to lose. The sun comes out briefly in the middle of the day and then retreats behind cloud again, which is the kind of weather decision that suggests the weather is not particularly invested in this voyage one way or the other. You eat your midday portion, the hard bread and the dried fish and the olives, sitting on the deck because there is nowhere else that is more comfortable, and the deck at least has the sky above it. The sea around you is the colour of pewter, and the swells are long and low, and the horizon is clear in all directions, which is information you note automatically now, the clear horizon being the version of the horizon that does not require immediate action. A crowded horizon, a horizon with weather in it, a horizon with the shape of an unexpected coast. These require different attention. The clear horizon allows you to eat your olives. A younger sailor, not much more than a boy when he joined the house, is working near you. He's from a family with no seafaring background, a merchant family from the interior of the hinterland who sent him to sea because an arrangement with the trading house was considered mutually beneficial. He has the eager competence of someone who has discovered that they are good at something unexpected, who has found, against the odds, that the sea agrees with them rather than rejecting them as it rejects people who do not have the physical tolerance for constant motion and the psychological tolerance for the specific combination of confinement and exposure that a working vessel provides. He will be a good sailor. He's learning the right things from the right people. But he's also at this stage still surprised by what the work actually involves, still in the phase where the gap between the idea of the sea and the reality of the sea is freshly visible to him. You remember that phase. You were not, in retrospect, particularly graceful about it. The sea does not make allowances for the adjustment period. It presents itself to each person who comes to it exactly as it is, without accommodation or patience. And some people discover quickly that they cannot handle what it actually is, and retreat to shore with no embarrassment required, because the sea is too important to be worked by people who cannot actually work it. And some people discover, more slowly and with more suffering, that they can handle it, that the motion becomes normal, that the cold becomes normal, that the particular intimacy of living at close quarters with a group of people on a vessel with no privacy becomes something you do not notice anymore rather than something you manage. You are beyond that phase now, in the phase where the sea is simply your working environment, with its particular properties and its particular demands. The phase has no name. It is just the condition of having done this long enough that the strangeness has gone out of it, which is both a loss and a considerable relief. The Carthaginian commercial network that you are part of, without being able to see most of it from any single vessel on any single voyage, was one of the most extensive in the ancient world. The city had colonies and trading posts stretched across the western Mediterranean and beyond, a network that had taken centuries to build and that functioned through relationships, through established procedures, through the accumulated knowledge of generations of sailors and merchants who had mapped the routes and identified the markets and understood what moved where and at what price. You are one node in this network, travelling one route in one direction on one voyage, but the route you travel connects to other routes, and those routes connect to others, and the whole thing, seen from above if you could see it from above, would look like a web extending from the harbour at Carthage in all the directions that commerce had followed from the founding of the city onward. The Phoenician tradition from which Carthage descended had always understood that trade was not just commerce, it was also intelligence, knowing what was available where and at what price, before your competitors knew it, was itself a form of power. The famous Carthaginian secretiveness about their trade routes was not simply paranoia, it was rational protection of a competitive advantage. If you know a route to a source of tin and no one else knows that route, you control the price of tin in every market you supply. The moment the route becomes common knowledge, the advantage is gone. The Carthaginians guarded their navigational knowledge as carefully as they guarded their commercial relationships, because both were forms of capital in a world where capital took many forms. This made Carthaginian sailors, at the more experienced levels, genuinely valuable assets to the trading houses that employed them, not just as labour, not just as muscle for the ropes and the bilge pump, but as repositories of knowledge that was economically significant. The pilot who knew exactly where the rocks were off a particular headland, exactly what time of year the winds shifted in a specific passage, exactly which captain, at which trading post in which foreign city could be trusted and which could not, was someone the house had an interest in retaining. Loyalty in the Carthaginian commercial world was maintained through interest as much as through sentiment, which is perhaps the most honest way to maintain loyalty, because interest is reliable in a way that sentiment sometimes is not. You think about this on the 4th day out of Sardinia, when the sky has cleared and the wind has shifted to something more favourable, and the ship is moving with the particular ease that comes when the conditions align with the heading, and the work becomes almost pleasant in its simplicity. You are going home, the cargo is good. The negotiations in Sardinia added something to the house's position that the house will be able to use. You did your part of the work correctly and you will be compensated for it, and you will be sent out again when the next voyage is ready. This is the cycle. This is the life. It is not a romantic life in the sense that people who have not lived it imagine it to be. The sea does not deliver romance to people who work it professionally. What it delivers is competence, which is not the same thing, but is, in its own way, more durable. The romance of the sea is a feeling had by people on the shore watching ships go out. The people on the ships are mostly thinking about the sail trim and the condition of the bilge and whether the watch schedule is going to be disrupted by the weather that looks like it might be building to the southwest. The beauty of it is real and experienced, but it is experienced as background rather than foreground, because the foreground is always the work. You have seen dolphins running alongside the vessel in the early morning, which is genuinely beautiful in a way that cannot be qualified away by pragmatism. You have seen the sun rise over a flat and absolutely still sea in the hour before the wind comes up, the water going from black to deep blue to the particular light blue of early morning, with a slowness that deserves more attention than anyone on watch typically has to give it. You have seen phosphorescence in the dark water at night, the glow of living things in the wave crests, which the sailors have various explanations for, none of which are correct in the sense of being accurate to what is actually happening in the water, but which reflect an attempt to understand something genuinely strange and beautiful through the frameworks available. You have seen storms that were terrible, and also, in the way that terrible things sometimes are, magnificent in scale and violence. The sea gives you things that the city cannot give you. They come packaged with everything else the sea gives you, which is less pleasant, but they come. The harbour, when it appears on the afternoon of the 5th day, is exactly where you expected it to be, which is itself a small satisfaction, the satisfaction of a calculation that turned out to be correct, of a navigation that placed you within sight of the thing you were navigating toward at approximately the time you expected to see it. The pilot stands at the bow and reads the coast, and nods with the quiet approval of someone who has made this particular calculation many times and is pleased to find that it worked again. You bring the ship in through the approaches with the care that the harbour requires, with the attention to the other traffic in the channels that is the constant navigation challenge of a busy commercial harbour, and you tie up at the dock and the cargo begins to come off almost before the ropes are fully secured. Carthage does not wait for you to have a moment. You already knew this. You were born for this city, or you were made for it, or both, and either way you belong to it in the specific way that sailors belong to the city that sends them out and receives them back, which is not the way that other people belong to cities, not the way of the person who has never left and does not think about leaving. You belong to it at a distance, which is the only way to belong to something you need to leave regularly in order to understand it properly. There are particular routes in the Carthaginian trading network that carried a weight of strangeness, even by the standards of ancient long-distance trade. The voyages beyond the Pillars of Hercules, beyond the strait that connected the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, into waters that most of the ancient world considered the edge of the known, were Carthaginian in a way that no other civilization of the period could claim. The Periplus of Hanno, a text that purports to describe a Carthaginian voyage of exploration down the west coast of Africa, if it is genuine and not a later construction, describes a journey that went further south along the African coast than any other ancient Mediterranean power managed to document. It describes landscapes, peoples, animals, and at the end, a fire-covered island and creatures that the Carthaginians could not identify, which subsequent readers have interpreted as gorillas or chimpanzees seen for the first time by Mediterranean eyes. You have not made that voyage, very few Carthaginians have, but you know sailors who have gone through the Pillars, who have seen the Atlantic and come back with accounts of the waters there, of the tides that operate on a scale that the tideless Mediterranean does not prepare you for, of the winds that behave differently than Mediterranean winds, of the fishing grounds that are astonishing in their abundance, of the peoples along the Iberian and African coasts who trade in ways that require adjustment when you arrive from the Mediterranean tradition. These accounts have the quality of everything that comes back from a long way away, which is partly accurate and partly shaped by the necessity of translating an experience into terms that people who have not had it can understand, and partly coloured by the knowledge that you have been somewhere that very few others have been, and that there is a currency in that knowledge worth spending carefully. The Atlantic voyages were part of what made Carthage's commercial reach genuinely exceptional. The tin that came from what is now Cornwall in Britain, transported down through Gaul or along the Atlantic coast by a chain of intermediary traders, before reaching Carthaginian commercial networks, was a commodity that the Mediterranean world needed, and that Carthage controlled the supply of through its positioning at the Atlantic end of the Mediterranean. The purple dye from the murex shellfish of the Atlantic coast of Morocco, which was considered even finer than the Tyrian purple of the eastern Mediterranean, was another Carthaginian specialty that depended on access to waters beyond the Pillars. The extraordinary range of goods that moved through Carthage reflected this reach, the city sitting at the pivot point between the Atlantic world and the Mediterranean world, taking things from each and putting them where the other needed them. This is what you are part of, on a smaller scale but connected to the same system, when you sail your route to Sardinia and back. You are one thread in a web that extends from the tin mines of Britain to the goldfields of West Africa, from the fishing grounds of the Atlantic to the markets of the eastern Mediterranean, and Carthage sits at the centre of it, not by accident, but by design, by generations of deliberate positioning, by the accumulated decisions of merchants and navigators and diplomats and occasionally soldiers, who understood what a city placed in this position could become and worked, generation by generation, to make it become that. The weight of that history is not something you think about explicitly on an ordinary voyage to Sardinia and back, but it is present in the route you sail, in the charts that the pilots carry and consult and add to, in the relationships with the trading posts that were established before you were born, and that you are now, through your voyages, contributing to and extending. Every voyage adds something, even if what it adds is only confirmation that the established route works, that the established relationships hold, that the system is functioning as it should. Confirmation is not nothing. It is the cumulative evidence that the system is sound, which is the evidence that allows the system to take larger risks when larger risks become available. Behind the civic image that Carthage presented to the world, behind the harbour and the grand temples and the reputation for commercial sophistication and political organisation that even Aristotle considered worth examining, there was a religious life that the city's enemies described with horror, that later defenders described as misunderstood, and that historians today discuss with the particular kind of careful energy that attends questions where the evidence is incomplete. The stakes of interpretation are high, and the people who could tell us the most about what was actually happening left almost nothing in their own words behind them. The official religious landscape of Carthage was organised around the two principal deities, Baal-Hamon and Tanit. Baal-Hamon was ancient, a god whose origins lay in the Phoenician religious tradition that Carthage had carried west from the Levantine coast when the city was founded. The name Baal simply means Lord in the Semitic languages, and there were many Baals in the ancient Near Eastern world, local and regional divine figures who shared a title rather than an identity. Baal-Hamon was associated with the sky, with fertility, with generative power, with the authority that rules and sustains the world from above. He was, in the religious imagination of the Punic world, a god of enormous consequence, one whose goodwill the city needed and whose displeasure was worth considerable effort to avoid. His presence in the city was visible, and his cult was maintained with the consistency that major civic religion requires, priests conducting regular ceremonies, festivals organised around his calendar, dedicatory inscriptions placed in the temples that bore his name. Tanit emerged over time as the most prominent deity in Carthage, her symbol appearing on hundreds of inscriptions and stone monuments across the entire Punic world, from Spain to Sicily to North Africa. The symbol is one of the most distinctive in ancient iconography, a triangular body, outstretched arms, and a circle for a head, simple in its elements and instantly recognisable in its repetition across centuries and thousands of miles of territory. She was called Face of Baal in some inscriptions, a title that suggests a relationship with the senior deity that is subordinate in one reading and complementary in another, and scholars have spent considerable time trying to characterise it, precisely without arriving at a consensus that everyone finds fully satisfying. Tanit seems to have been associated with fertility, with the moon, with a protective maternal aspect that made her particularly relevant to prayers concerning children, family and survival. She was the deity most personally addressed in the dedicatory inscriptions that Carthaginians erected throughout their world, the divine figure to whom ordinary people directed their most urgent petitions. The worship of these gods was, by the standards of ancient Mediterranean religion, largely unremarkable in its outward form. Temples were maintained on the Bursa and in other parts of the city. Priests conducted their duties according to procedures that had been established over generations and which, like most priestly routines in the ancient world, combined the genuinely spiritual with the institutionally administrative in proportions that varied by context. Festivals were observed with a combination of sincere religious feeling and civic social function that major festivals in any ancient city combined. Offerings were made of the kind that ancient Mediterranean religions routinely required: animals, agricultural products, incense, oil, the material tokens of devotion that were understood to maintain the relationship between the human community and the divine powers it depended on. And then there is the Tophet. The word itself is not Carthaginian. It comes from the Hebrew Bible, where it refers to a site in the Hinnom Valley outside Jerusalem associated with practices that the biblical authors found profoundly troubling and described in language of strong condemnation. In the archaeological context of the Punic world, the Tophet has come to refer to a specific kind of sanctuary site, found in Carthage and in a number of other Punic settlements across the western Mediterranean, where the cremated remains of young children and animals were interred in ceramic urns and covered by inscribed stone monuments, stelae, dedicated to Baal-Hamon and Tanit. The Carthaginian Tophet, the sanctuary of Salammbô in the city itself, named for the neighbourhood where it was excavated in the 19th and 20th centuries, has been the subject of archaeological investigation for more than 100 years. It contains thousands of urns. It was in use for centuries from the early period of Carthage's history through to the city's destruction by Rome in 146 before the Common Era. It is, by any measure, one of the most significant and also most contested archaeological sites from the ancient world. The ancient literary sources, primarily Greek and Roman writers who were not admirers of Carthage and were writing at various removes from the practices they described, some of them, centuries after the fact, claimed that the Carthaginians sacrificed children to their gods. They described ceremonies in which firstborn children, or children offered by families seeking divine favour in moments of crisis, were brought to the sanctuary and killed as the most extreme expression of devotion and the most powerful petition available. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, described a bronze statue with outstretched arms tilted in such a way that whatever was placed in them would roll into a fire below. He described this in the context of a desperate moment during a siege when the Carthaginians, believing they had neglected the gods, offered 200 children from the finest families of the city. Other writers made similar claims in varying degrees of detail. Plutarch mentioned it. Various Roman sources used it as an index of Carthaginian barbarism in contexts where establishing Carthaginian barbarism served a particular rhetorical purpose. Here the historian has to pause and note something that is not a small observation. The overwhelming majority of ancient literary testimony about Carthaginian child sacrifice comes from people who were, at various times and in various ways, enemies of Carthage. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The Greeks competed with Carthaginian commercial interests in Sicily and the Western Mediterranean for centuries. The Romans fought 3 Punic wars against Carthage and ultimately destroyed the city completely. The Hebrew biblical tradition viewed the worship of Baal as the central religious error of the surrounding peoples. None of these sources is disinterested. None of them was writing from inside Carthaginian religious life with the purpose of explaining it accurately to posterity. They were writing from the outside, often from enmity, often with specific purposes that were served by the darkest possible interpretation of Carthaginian practice. This does not mean the sources are simply wrong. Ancient writers sometimes preserve accurate information about their enemies, and the specific consistency of the child sacrifice claim across multiple independent traditions does have to be accounted for. But it does mean that the ancient literary testimony cannot be taken at face value without serious critical examination, and that the question of what was actually happening requires a much more careful look at what the archaeology actually shows. The urns in the Topet do contain the cremated remains of young children and infants, and also animals, primarily sheep and goats. This has been established by multiple analyses of the physical remains, with more sophisticated techniques applied in more recent decades as bioarchaeology has developed better methods. The inscriptions on the stele are dedicated to Baal Hammon and Tanit, and use language that in several cases has been translated as referencing a vow, a promise made to the god that is being fulfilled through this deposition. Some of the inscriptions use a term, the MLK in Punic, that has been interpreted as referring to the offering itself, though the precise meaning of this term has been one of the central technical debates in the scholarly literature on the subject. This much is not substantially disputed. The urns are there. The remains are those of very young children. The dedications are real and were made with deliberate religious intent. What is disputed is what it means. The argument for actual child sacrifice, the interpretation that aligns most closely with the ancient literary sources, holds that these are the remains of infants and young children who were killed as religious offerings to Baal Hammon and Tanit, that this practice was a regular feature of Carthaginian civic religion, rather than an extreme measure reserved for crisis moments, and that the frequency and scale of the depositions over several centuries represents a sustained institutional practice embedded in the religious life of the community. The advocates of this interpretation point to the inscriptions, to the animal remains, which appear in some contexts as substitutes that suggest the original offering was intended to be human, to the consistency of the ancient literary testimony, and to parallels with biblical condemnations of similar practices in the ancient Levant. The counter-argument, developed with increasing force and detail by scholars beginning in the 1980s and continuing to the present, holds that the Topet was primarily a burial ground for infants who died of natural causes in the period shortly before or after birth, that the animal remains represent accompanying sacrifices made at the time of burial, rather than evidence of substitution for human sacrifice, that the dedicatory language reflects the integration of a death into a religious framework, rather than a description of how the death was caused, and that the high proportion of neonates and very young infants in the sample is consistent with natural mortality patterns rather than selective killing. Advocates of this position point to the extraordinarily high rates of infant mortality that any ancient population experienced, particularly in the first months of life, to the relatively small number of individual depositions when divided across several centuries of use, and to the absence of the kinds of skeletal trauma markers that might be expected if these children had been killed rather than dying naturally. The back and forth between these positions has been genuinely productive as scholarship rather than simply contentious, producing increasingly sophisticated analyses of the physical remains, increasingly careful readings of the inscriptions, and increasingly honest assessments of what the ancient literary sources can and cannot tell us about what was actually happening inside Carthaginian religious life. A third position has emerged in the scholarship that holds that neither the simple sacrifice interpretation nor the simple natural mortality interpretation fully accounts for all the evidence, and that the Tophet probably received the remains of both children who died naturally and, at least in some circumstances, children who were deliberately offered, and that determining which category any particular burial falls into from the archaeological record alone may be effectively impossible. This is a less satisfying conclusion than either of the clean alternatives. It does not give the reader the clear answer that the material seems to demand, the definitive resolution of whether Carthage was doing something that the modern world would find abhorrent or whether the Romans and Greeks were simply slandering a commercial rival with accusations designed to make them easier to destroy. The discomfort of sitting with that inconclusiveness is real, and it is appropriate, because that discomfort reflects an honest engagement with the limits of what we actually know about a civilization whose own voice was deliberately suppressed. What the debate reveals, regardless of where any individual historian comes down on it, is something important about how ancient civilizations worked and how we understand them. The Carthaginians left relatively few written records compared to Rome or Greece, and those they did leave were largely destroyed when the city was destroyed. The Punic language texts that survive come primarily from epitaphs, dedicatory inscriptions, and agricultural manuals, not from the literature, history, theology, or political philosophy that would give us the inside view of a civilization's self-understanding. Almost everything we know about Carthaginian religious practice, political culture, and daily life comes filtered through the accounts of people who are not Carthaginian and who often had strong reasons to portray Carthage in the worst available light. This is a structural problem that shapes everything. The Tophet, whatever it was also not secret. This is a fact that cuts differently depending on how you interpret the site. The sanctuary was visible within the city. The stelae were inscribed and set up in public view, not hidden. The depositions were made with the involvement of priests and formal religious apparatus. Whatever was happening there was happening in the open, with the knowledge and apparent approval of the community. There were no whispered rumours about hidden practices at the Tophet. There were no internal Carthaginian voices condemning it, or none that survive. It was part of the city's sacred landscape, in a way that was acknowledged rather than concealed. If it was sacrifice, this means it was not aberrant sacrifice, not an underground practice conducted in spite of community norms. It was sacrifice embedded in civic religion at the highest level, sanctioned by the political and priestly establishment, understood by the community as the most extreme available form of devotion, the thing you did when you needed the gods to understand how serious you were. This is horrifying by the moral standards of later periods, and also by any modern standard. It is also, in the internal logic of ancient religious thinking about divine power and human obligation, comprehensible in a way that the horror should not prevent us from examining. Ancient religions operated within a framework where the gods were real, powerful, and capable of withholding what human communities desperately needed: rain, favourable weather, victory in battle, successful harvests, children who survived their first years. The things offered to gods were the things that mattered most. That logic runs through ancient religion across cultures and should give anyone pause before reaching quickly for condemnation. If it was primarily natural mortality burial, this means the site was a formal sacred space for the community's most vulnerable members, infants and young children who had died before they were old enough to be fully integrated into the human community, maintained with religious attention and careful commemoration across centuries. This is a very different reading of the same physical remains, one that transforms the Tophet from evidence of barbarity into evidence of a specific kind of religious care for the youngest and most fragile lives in the city. The priests of Baal Hammon and Tanit were figures of genuine authority in Carthage, connected to the political establishment in the ways that priestly establishments always connected with political power when they existed in the same city long enough. The temples owned land, the festivals required resources. The administration of the sacred sites was a form of institutional power that intersected with civic power through family ties, through economic relationships, through the mutual interest in maintaining the structures that gave both their authority. A city's religious life is never simply its religious life. It is also its political life, its social life, its way of organising collective identity and collective obligation in terms that carry the weight of divine sanction. And Carthage organised a great deal of collective identity through its religious life. The city that went to war sent its forces with divine sanction. The city that concluded treaties did so with divine witness. The city that built temples and maintained the Tophet and sent its children to priestly service was a city that understood its relationship with its gods as the foundation of everything else it did. Its commerce, its military power, its political arrangements, its survival. The Roman destruction of Carthage was physical and deliberate. It also had a cultural dimension that was perhaps more effective in the long run. By destroying the city and its records and continuing to narrate Carthaginian history from the Roman perspective, Rome ensured that the Punic voice in its own story was largely silenced. The Tophet sits at the centre of that silence, containing within its thousands of urns a question that refuses to be answered cleanly, and that continues to resist the satisfying resolution that modern readers and ancient polemicists alike have always wanted it to provide. And that refusal is itself a kind of testimony. Carthage was not simple. Its religion was not simple. The city that Alyssa built on a strip of North African coast, and that became one of the powers of the ancient Mediterranean, was layered in ways that its destruction was partly intended to erase. The erasure was not complete. The questions remain, the urns remain, and the careful, ongoing argument about what they mean is a form of attention that the city, after everything, continues to command. The religious year in Carthage was organised around a calendar of festivals and observances that structured time in the way that religious calendars always structure time in civilizations that take their gods seriously, which is to say completely, in every season, with no month left unmarked by some form of divine attention. The priests of Balhammon and Tanit maintained this calendar, determined the proper conduct of each observance, and served as the institutional memory of what the gods required and when they required it. This was not ceremonial work in the sense of being merely formal. In a civilization where the relationship between the human community and the divine powers was understood as real, consequential, and capable of producing specific good or bad outcomes, depending on how well it was maintained, the priests were doing something that the community depended on with the same practical urgency that it depended on sailors and farmers and the officials who managed the harbour. The great festival cycle connected the religious life of the city to its commercial life in ways that were not entirely separable. Festivals were times of public gathering, of the suspension of ordinary commercial activity for something higher, but they were also times of the movement of people and goods that the suspension of ordinary activity generates. The food and drink required for celebrations, the offerings required for sacrifices, the presence of visitors from the Carthaginian territories who came to the city for major festivals and spent their time there in ways that were not without commercial dimension. The sacred economy and the commercial economy were not the same thing, but they were not entirely different things either, which is the condition of any ancient city that takes its religious life seriously and also happens to be primarily organised around trade. The priestly class in Carthage was connected to the noble families in ways that ancient priestly establishments typically were in urban civilizations. Priestly office was not open to anyone. It was held by people with the right connections, the right family background, the right social position, to be entrusted with the care of the most important divine relationships the city maintained. This meant that the temples were governed by people who had financial interests in the city's commerce, family connections to the merchant families who controlled policy, and personal stakes in the outcomes of the political decisions that were made in the councils and assemblies where the great families dominated. The priest who conducted the rites at the temple of Baal-Hamon on the Bursa was not a figure separate from the commercial and political world of Carthage. He was embedded in it, through every tie of family and interest and shared identity. This is not necessarily corruption. It is simply the condition of ancient urban religious life, where the boundary between sacred and secular was drawn very differently than it would be in later periods, where the idea that religious authority should be separate from temporal power was not yet a principle that anyone had articulated in terms that would have been recognizable to a Carthaginian priest. The priest served the god. The priest also served his family's interests. These two things were not understood as being in tension because the framework that would make them feel like they should be in tension did not yet exist. What did exist was the awareness of divine displeasure and its potential consequences. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about Carthaginian religious life, the seriousness with which the relationship between the city and its gods was understood to affect real outcomes. A city that sent fleets to sea in the ancient Mediterranean had every reason to believe that divine favour was a practical factor in whether those fleets returned. A city that depended on agricultural production from its hinterland had every reason to believe that divine goodwill affected whether the rains came at the right time and in the right quantities. A city engaged in military competition with Greek colonies in Sicily and eventually with Rome had every reason to believe that the outcome of battles was not determined entirely by the number and skill of the combatants. This context matters for understanding the Tophet, because whatever was happening there, the most extreme explanation or the more moderate one, it was happening in a world where the stakes of divine relationship were understood as genuinely high. If the Carthaginians believed that the offering of the most precious thing they had, the lives of their children, was what the gods required in moments of supreme crisis, this belief would have been consistent with the logic of their entire religious framework. You give what matters most when you need the most. If they believed that the Tophet was where they placed children who had died before being fully integrated into the human community, offering them formally to the divine powers in a ceremony that acknowledged their brief existence and commended them to divine care, this too would have been consistent with a religious framework that understood the boundary between the divine and human worlds as permeable and managed through ritual. The argument about what the Tophet was is also, at a deeper level, an argument about what ancient religion was, about whether it is possible to understand practices that were embedded in a framework of belief so different from anything most modern readers inhabit that the intuitions we bring to evaluation are likely to be systematically misleading. This is the hardest kind of historical problem, the kind where the obstacle to understanding is not insufficient evidence, but insufficient imagination, the inability to enter into a form of life sufficiently different from our own, to understand it from the inside, rather than always evaluating it from the outside. The Carthaginians who stood in the sanctuary and made their dedications and placed their urns were doing something that made sense to them. It made sense within a framework that they had not invented but had inherited, that had been refined over generations of practice, that was confirmed every time the city prospered and challenged every time it suffered. They were in relationship with powers they understood as real. They were managing that relationship with the seriousness that the stakes demanded. Whatever they were doing in the Tophet was what that relationship required, as they understood the requirement. We look at the urns and we see something that demands interpretation. They looked at the sanctuary and saw the place where the most serious business of their relationship with the divine was conducted. These two views of the same thing are not easily reconciled, and the attempt to reconcile them is part of what makes the history of Carthage genuinely difficult and genuinely interesting. The city's eventual fate added another layer to the complexity. When Rome destroyed Carthage, it destroyed not only the physical city but also the institutional memory that might have allowed the Carthaginians themselves to explain their practices to later generations. The Tophet was abandoned when the city was destroyed. The priests who maintained it were killed or enslaved. The theological tradition that gave the sanctuary its meaning was interrupted and not resumed in the same form. What remained was the physical evidence, the urns and the stelae and the remains within them, and the literary testimony of people who had described it from the outside, often with hostility and sometimes with genuine horror, but never with the insider knowledge that would have made their descriptions fully reliable. Rome also built a new city on the site of Carthage, Colonia Julia Carthago, which became one of the most important cities of the late Roman Empire, a major centre of Christian theology in the period when the faith was being defined through the arguments of figures like Tertullian and Cyprian and Augustine, all of whom were associated with this North African Carthage. The new city overlay the old one, partially disturbing the archaeological record of what had been there before, reusing stones and materials from Punic buildings for Roman ones, covering some areas and exposing others in patterns that depended on where the new city needed to expand. The relationship between the two Carthages, the Punic one that Rome destroyed and the Roman one that Rome built on the same site, is archaeologically complicated in ways that continue to affect what can be known about the earlier city. Augustine, who is perhaps the most consequential theological thinker, associated with Carthage, and who lived in the city for years in the late 4th and early 5th century of the Common Era, was aware of the Punic past of the place where he lived. He mentioned Punic customs and Punic words in his writings. He was aware of the pre-Roman inhabitants of the region in a way that suggests the memory of Punic culture had not been entirely erased even 4 centuries after the city's destruction. But his relationship to that past was complicated by his Christianity, which could not look at the religious practices of the ancient Punic world without the interpretive framework of his own tradition, including the biblical tradition that had condemned the worship of Baal in the most explicit terms available. The Carthage Augustine knew was a Christian city built on the ruins of a pagan one, and his sense of what the pagan one had been was shaped by sources that were not neutral. This is the final difficulty of understanding ancient Carthage. The sources are hostile, the physical evidence is ambiguous, and the interpretive frameworks available to us are all shaped by traditions that came after the city and that saw it through lenses ground for other purposes. We're trying to understand a civilization from the outside, with the tools of people who destroyed it, or condemned it, or built their own cities on its ruins, and this means that every conclusion we reach has to carry with it an acknowledgement of the limits of our perspective. What the Topet ultimately represents, beyond the specific argument about sacrifice and burial, is the depth of that problem. It is where the complexity of understanding ancient Carthage is most concentrated, where the stakes of interpretation feel highest, and where the temptation to reach for a clean resolution is strongest and should be most resisted. The clean resolutions, Carthage as barbarian civilization whose practices justified its destruction, or Carthage as victim of Roman slander whose practices have been systematically misrepresented, are both more satisfying than the actual situation, which is a place and a people whose religious life we understand imperfectly, through the eyes of people who wish them ill, with evidence that can support multiple interpretations, and with the added difficulty that the most direct testimony, the Carthaginians themselves, was silenced when the city burned. And so tonight comes to its quiet close, somewhere in the slow drift between listening and sleep, between the world of the past and the particular dark of your own room, wherever in the world that room happens to be tonight. We began this evening in the streets of Carthage itself, inside the daily life of a city that was wealthy and loud and layered and demanding, in the specific way that cities become when they have organized their entire existence around the movement of goods across uncertain water. You walked those streets, and you felt what it cost to simply be there, to wake up on a mat that was not quite right, to navigate a grain market against someone who had been doing this considerably longer than you, to absorb the heat of the midday and the smell of the harbour, and the noise of a commercial district that had been running at full intensity since before dawn, and would continue long after the sun went down. The city did not ask for your assessment of it. It did not ask how you were finding the experience. It simply continued in the relentless way that commercial cities continue, because the ships were always arriving, or about to arrive, or already overdue, because the markets were always either opening or closing, because somewhere in the harbour a deal was always either being made or falling apart, and the city needed you to keep up or get out of the way. There is something both exhausting and genuinely alive about a place like that. The modern descendants of Carthage's commercial tradition are recognisable in every major trading port in the world today, cities that organise themselves around the movement of things, where the energy of commerce is not one feature of the place but the central fact of it, where waking up means immediately entering a system that was running before you arrived and will continue after you leave. The intensity is the point. The intensity is what made Carthage matter, and the people who lived inside that intensity, who woke up every morning on the not quite right mat and ate the bread that had decided it was no longer interested in being soft and went out into the noise and the smell and the relentless forward motion of the commercial city, were not remarkable people in any historical sense. They were ordinary people doing what the city required, which was everything continuously, without pause for reflection about whether this was what they would have chosen if choosing had been on offer. Then we spent time with Alyssa, who brought that city into existence through a combination of political necessity, extraordinary resourcefulness, and the kind of decisive action that tends to appear in the historical record only when someone has absolutely no other options left. She left Tyre with a group of followers and the wealth of a murdered husband, and an understanding of what a good harbour site looked like, and she arrived on a coast in North Africa and turned an agreement about Hyde into a city. The specifics of how she did this have been argued over for millennia. The fact that she did it is not in question. Carthage existed. It grew into one of the great powers of the ancient Mediterranean. It stood for centuries. And the woman who founded it is still being discussed, still being interpreted, still being contested by people who find that the easy versions of her story do not quite hold the full weight of what she appears to have been. That is what tends to happen to people who build consequential things. They get simplified. The myths that accumulate around them serve various purposes: the purposes of later political programs, the purposes of cultural identity, the purposes of narrative satisfaction. Virgil's Dido is more famous than the Alyssa, and considerably less accurate, in the way that the stories we tell about founders are often more revealing about the tellers than about the founders themselves. The woman who stood in front of a pyre and made the decision she made was doing something more complicated than dying for love. She was navigating an impossible situation with the tools available to her, which had always been intelligence and nerve rather than armies or accumulated male authority, and she reached the end of the navigation and made the final choice. You can call that tragedy, you can call it triumph, you can call it both. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. She would probably have found the debate about her less interesting than its continuance would have interested her, because she was not, by any account, a woman who spent much time looking backward when there was something ahead that required attention. Then you went to sea, because Carthage was always going to send you to sea eventually. The harbour was the city's heart and the ships were its blood, and the sailors who crewed them were the mechanism by which everything the city believed about itself was either confirmed or contradicted every time a vessel left the harbour and encountered the actual Mediterranean rather than the theoretical one. The sea is the great leveller of pretension. It does not accept the carefully worded version of how things are going. It presents conditions that are what they are, without adjustment for your expectations or your preparations, and it asks what you can actually do with those conditions using the skills you actually have. The sailors of Carthage answered that question across 3 centuries of commercial dominance in the Western Mediterranean, on routes that no other civilization of the period understood as well, in weather that made no special accommodations for them, against competitors who sometimes had more than commercial disagreement in mind. They came back, most of them, most of the time, and the city grew wealthy on what they brought back, and sent them out again. There is something in that rhythm, the going out and the coming back, the departure and the return, that is as old as seafaring and as old as the particular anxiety of people who love someone who has gone out on the water. You felt it from the inside tonight, from the perspective of someone in the storm rather than watching it from the shore. The smell of the harbour on return, the solid ground that seems to move because the body has forgotten what stillness feels like, the cargo that needs to be accounted for, the accounting that will be done before any rest is permitted, because Carthage does not pause for sentiment even when sentiment is entirely warranted. You survived the storm and the sea gave you back, and the city absorbed your return and put you back to work. This is the cycle. This is the life. And then we stood at the edge of the question that Carthage has been asking the centuries since its destruction. The question of the Tophet, the sanctuary, the urns, the inscriptions, the children, the gods, and what the Carthaginians were actually doing in that place, and what it meant, and what we should think about it now that we can no longer ask them. The answer is not clean. The answer may never be clean. The archaeology is real, and the ancient testimony is real, and the gap between them is real, and may be the most honest thing about the whole inquiry. We do not know, with certainty, what Carthage did in that sanctuary. We know that it mattered to them. We know they maintained it for centuries. We know they dedicated it to their most important gods. We know that the question of what was happening there has the capacity to change how we understand the civilization and the capacity to reveal what we are projecting onto the past from the present. Both of those things are worth noticing, and we know that the people who made those dedications, whoever they were and whatever they were doing there, were people who believed what they believed with the full weight of lives lived inside that belief, without the distance that later centuries and later frameworks would create between the action and its meaning. The thread connecting all 4 of tonight's stories is something that runs through every civilization we visit on this channel, something that turns out to be true in ancient Carthage, and in every other place and time where human beings have organised themselves into something that called itself a city, or an empire, or a system of any kind. the gap between how things appear and how they actually are, the weight that systems place on individuals, and the way individuals find their way inside those systems, sometimes with discipline, sometimes with resistance, sometimes with the specific ingenuity of someone who has no other tools available and cannot afford to be stopped, the merchant in the market, the sailor in the storm, the founder on the pyre, the priest at the sanctuary, all of them inside structures larger than themselves, all of them doing what people always do inside such structures, which is endure, adapt, navigate, and occasionally, when the situation demands it, surprise themselves with what they can survive. Carthage was glamorous from the outside and complicated on the inside. It was powerful and fragile at the same time, the way all cities built on trade are simultaneously powerful and fragile, because trade depends on conditions, on weather and routes and relationships, and the continued willingness of multiple parties to keep doing business, and conditions change. It was sophisticated and strange in equal measure, a Phoenician city that had transplanted itself to Africa and grown there into something that was both deeply itself and shaped by where it had grown, layered with the influences of every culture it had traded with and competed with over 5 centuries of Mediterranean engagement. It was eventually destroyed by people who had decided, rationally or irrationally or both, that it could not be allowed to continue, and then it refused in the end to be fully erased. History has a way of preserving the things that were intended to be lost. The stories of the people who are destroyed, if they are unusual enough or consequential enough or simply human enough, find their way through the gap in ways that the destroyers did not intend and could not prevent. Carthage left no literature that survived. It left no philosophy in its own voice, no theology, no history written from the Punic perspective. What it left were urns in the ground, and inscriptions on stones and the shape of a harbour that was remarkable enough that ancient writers described it in terms that still convey the impression. And it left, through the very hostility of its enemies, a record of what they found threatening enough to attack, interesting enough to describe, and consequential enough to destroy so thoroughly. You can learn a great deal about a civilization from what its enemies said about it, with enough critical distance to notice what the criticism reveals about the critics as much as about the criticized. The sea outside some other window, wherever tonight finds you, is doing what the sea always does, which is continue, without particular concern for anything we have said about it this evening, without particular concern for anything at all except its own deep rhythms, the same rhythms that carried Carthaginian ships out of that harbour and brought them back, and carried Alyssa's fleet from Tyre to the Gulf of Tunis, and that will carry whatever comes next without pause or acknowledgement. The sea has been continuing in this way since before Carthage existed, and will be continuing long after the last historian finishes arguing about the Tophet. It is good to remember this occasionally. It puts things in proportion. Let your breathing slow now. Let the harbour noise fade, the fish sauce and the salt water and the tar and all of it, slowly dissolving into the quieter sound of wherever you actually are. Let the market quiet itself and the streets empty and the smell of the city release gently, because it is evening in Carthage too, in whatever imaginary version of Carthage you have been inhabiting tonight. The streets can wait for another night. The ships are in harbour. The sanctuary is still. The grain seller has closed his stall and the negotiations have ended, and the city is in the process of not quite sleeping, in the way it never quite sleeps, but of shifting into the register that passes for rest in a place that cannot fully stop. You have travelled a long way tonight, across the Mediterranean and back, through a storm and through a market and through the life of a woman who built a city, and through the arguments that still surround a sanctuary that everyone agrees matters and no one agrees about. That is far enough for one evening. Further, in fact, than most evenings take you. Let it settle. Let the particular weight of a complicated history rest lightly on whatever part of you received it tonight. The questions will be there in the morning, patient and genuinely interesting and not going anywhere, because the past is not in a hurry, and the good questions never resolve themselves simply out of impatience. They wait, in the ground and in the stones and in the imperfect record, for whoever is willing to sit with them long enough to understand how complicated the answers actually are. For now the journey is finished, you have seen enough. Rest well. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.